What is an insane-sounding theory that is actually believable when the evidence is presented? Story 1. One idea that sounds like pure science fiction, until you see the evidence, is that time itself doesn't pass at the same rate everywhere. Most of us grow up thinking of time as this universal thing that flows the same for everyone. 1 second is 1 second, no matter where you are. But Einstein's theory of relativity completely broke that assumption. According to relativity, time is tied to motion and gravity. If you move extremely fast, close to the speed of light, your clock actually runs slower compared to someone standing still. The same thing happens in strong gravitational fields. The closer you are to something massive, like a planet or black hole, the more time slows down relative to someone farther away. That sounds like a weird thought experiment, but it's not just theory. Scientists have tested this directly using incredibly precise atomic clocks. When identical clocks were placed on airplanes and flown around the world, they came back showing slightly different times compared to the clocks that stayed on the ground. The difference was tiny, but exactly what relativity predicted. Even more mind-bending is that this effect matters for everyday technology. The satellites that make up the GPS system orbit high above Earth and move extremely fast. Because of their speed and the weaker gravity up there, time on those satellites runs slightly faster than time on the surface of Earth. If engineers didn't constantly correct for this difference, GPS locations would drift by kilometers within a day. So something that sounds completely insane, that time literally flows at different speeds depending on where you are, is not only real, it's something our technology has to account for every single day. Story 2. Quantum entanglement. The basic idea is that two particles can become linked in such a way that measuring one instantly tells you something about the other, even if they are extremely far apart. Not metaphorically linked, but physically described by the same quantum state. They stop behaving like two independent objects and start acting like parts of the same system. For example, imagine two particles that share a property like spin. Before measurement, the system is in a kind of probability state where neither particle has a definite value yet. But the moment you measure one particle and find its spin pointing one way, the other particle immediately takes the corresponding opposite value. The strange part is that distance doesn't seem to matter. Those particles could be on opposite sides of the planet or even light years apart, and the correlation still appears the instant the measurement happens. This bothered Einstein so much that he called it spooky action at a distance. For a long time, many physicists suspected there had to be some hidden mechanism behind it. But over the years, experiments testing something called Bell's inequalities repeatedly confirmed that entangled particles behave exactly the way quantum theory predicts. The results rule out most classical explanations. Important detail, though, this doesn't allow faster-than-light communication. You can't use entanglement to send messages instantly across space. The connection only becomes clear when scientists later compare their measurements. Still, the universe allowing particles to stay mysteriously connected across huge distances is about as weird as physics gets. Story 3. Honestly, one of the wildest things in science is that all of quantum mechanics sounds insane, and yet experiment after experiment keeps confirming it. Quantum mechanics is the framework we use to describe how nature works at very small scales: atoms, electrons, photons, and other subatomic particles. But the rules it follows are nothing like the everyday physics we're used to. For example, particles don't have definite positions until you measure them. Instead, they exist in a probability cloud, meaning they're mathematically described as being in multiple possible states at once. That's the idea behind superposition, where something can effectively be in several places or configurations simultaneously until observation forces one outcome. Then, There's things like electrons behaving both as particles and waves, depending on how you measure them. The famous double-slit experiment shows this beautifully. Individual particles fired one at a time can create an interference pattern, like waves, as if each particle somehow passed through multiple paths at once. Even stranger is the role of measurement itself. In quantum mechanics, the act of observing a system can change its behavior. That's not philosophical speculation. It's something that shows up in actual laboratory experiments. And despite how bizarre all this sounds, quantum mechanics is one of the most successful theories in the history of science. It predicts experimental results with incredible precision. Modern technology like lasers, semiconductors, MRI machines, and transistors all rely on quantum effects to function. What's especially strange is that even though the math works perfectly, scientists still debate what it all means. Different interpretations try to explain what's really happening behind the equations. So, we have this theory that describes reality incredibly well, but the deeper explanation of why it works the way it does is still one of the biggest mysteries in physics. Story 4. Many UFO sightings from the 1970s through the 1990s were actually early military drones or experimental aircraft. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were pouring enormous amounts of money into aerospace research. A lot of that work was extremely classified, especially projects involving reconnaissance, stealth technology, and unmanned aircraft. The public usually didn't hear about these programs until decades later. Drones are a good example. Today, we think of drones as normal military tools, but the technology started much earlier than people realize. Experimental unmanned aircraft were already being tested in the 1960s and 70s, and by the 80s, there were increasingly advanced prototypes flying at high altitudes or performing unusual maneuvers. From the perspective of someone on the ground, that could easily look like something unexplainable. Many of these aircraft didn't resemble traditional airplanes. Some had unusual shapes, flew silently, hovered, or moved in ways people weren't used to seeing. Because the programs were classified, officials couldn't exactly explain what witnesses had seen, which left a lot of sightings labeled as unidentified. There's also a long pattern of secret aircraft eventually becoming public knowledge. The U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the F-117 stealth fighter were all flying for years before the public knew they existed. Early sightings of those aircraft were sometimes reported as UFOs simply because they looked and behaved differently from known planes. So while not every UFO sighting has a clear explanation, it's very plausible that a large portion of them were actually people catching glimpses of early experimental military technology decades before it was revealed. Story 5. Michael Jordan. One theory that has floated around sports discussions for years is that Michael Jordan's first retirement from basketball in 1993 wasn't really voluntary, but was actually an unofficial suspension related to gambling on basketball. On the surface, the timing looked strange. Jordan had just won 3 straight NBA championships with the Chicago Bulls and was widely considered the best player in the world. Then suddenly, at the peak of his career, he announced he was stepping away from basketball to pursue baseball. Officially, the explanation was that he had lost motivation after the murder of his father and needed a break from the game. That's the story everyone heard publicly, but there was already a lot of attention on Jordan's gambling habits at the time. Stories had come out about him betting large sums of money on golf games and other activities, and there were investigations connected to a businessman who had written checks linked to gambling debts. Because the NBA has extremely strict rules about betting on basketball, some people began speculating that the league might have quietly pressured Jordan to step away rather than risk the biggest scandal in the sport's history. The theory suggests that letting the league's biggest star retire for a while was a cleaner solution than publicly suspending him. There's never been any concrete evidence proving that happened, and the NBA has always denied it. But the reason the theory keeps circulating is because the timeline raises eyebrows. Jordan retires suddenly in 1993, spends about a year and a half away from basketball, then returns and immediately starts winning championships again. It's one of those sports rumors that sounds crazy, but just believable enough that people still debate it decades later. Story 6. The Dead Internet Theory. The basic idea is that a huge portion of what we see online today isn't actually created by real people anymore. Instead, it's generated by bots, algorithms, marketing systems, and automated accounts that produce content designed to keep engagement going. The theory claims that the internet used to feel more human in the early 2000s and 2010s. Forums, blogs, comment sections, random personal websites. But over time, large platforms optimized everything for engagement, advertising, and algorithm-driven feeds. Now, a lot of what people see online is curated by recommendation systems rather than discovered naturally. At the same time, automated accounts have become incredibly common. Social media platforms are filled with bot accounts used for advertising, political influence, spam, and engagement farming. Add in AI-generated articles, automated news summaries, content farms, and mass-produced social media posts, and the internet can start to feel oddly artificial. The theory doesn't literally claim that humans disappeared from the internet. The more realistic version of it is that a growing percentage of online content is machine-generated or algorithmically amplified, which changes the overall feel of the web. Instead of millions of individuals posting random things, much of what surfaces to the top is optimized content designed to keep people scrolling. When people talk about the dead internet, they're usually reacting to that shift. The web still has real people on it, but the environment around them is increasingly shaped by bots, algorithms, and automated systems that weren't there in the early days of the internet. Story 7. Gravity being the same force everywhere. Before the 1600s, people didn't think the heavens and earth followed the same rules. The sky was considered a completely different realm from the world we live in. Objects falling to the ground were explained one way, while the motion of planets and stars was treated as something separate, almost mystical. Then Isaac Newton came along and proposed something radical. The same force that pulls an apple toward the ground is also responsible for keeping the moon orbiting Earth and the planets orbiting the sun. That sounds obvious today, but at the time it was a huge leap. Newton suggested that gravity acts between all objects with mass, and that it works across enormous distances. In other words, the universe isn't divided into Earth rules and heaven rules. The same physical laws apply everywhere. The idea helped explain why planets follow predictable paths and why the moon doesn't just drift away into space. It also allowed scientists to calculate planetary motion with remarkable accuracy. What's fascinating is that this kind of thinking wasn't always safe historically. In earlier centuries, challenging the accepted view of the cosmos could be seen as challenging religious authority. There were still harsh laws on the books in parts of Europe for heresy, and openly proposing ideas that contradicted traditional cosmology could be dangerous in the wrong place or time. So the suggestion that the same invisible force pulling down an apple controls the motion of the entire solar system sounded almost absurd to many people back then. Today, it's one of the basic principles that explains how the universe works. Story 8. One theory that sounds dystopian at first, but becomes oddly believable when you look at how modern platforms work, is the idea that AI systems optimized for engagement could gradually push society toward chaos, not because they're evil, but because they're doing exactly what they were designed to do. Modern recommendation algorithms are trained with a very simple goal: maximize things like clicks, watch time, engagement, and time spent on the platform. The system doesn't understand truth, social stability, or long-term consequences. It just learns which content keeps people interacting. And over time, the data has shown something uncomfortable. Content that triggers strong emotions spreads the most. Outrage, fear, tribal conflict, and controversy tend to keep people commenting, sharing, and coming back for more. So when algorithms learn from engagement patterns, they naturally start surfacing more of that kind of content because it performs better by the metric they're optimizing for. Philosopher Nick Bostrom described a similar concept in thought experiments about maximizer systems, machines given a simple objective that pursue it relentlessly without understanding the broader consequences. In theory, a system optimizing for a narrow goal could unintentionally reshape the world around that objective. Applied to the internet, the concern is that recommendation systems slowly amplify the most emotionally charged material, because that's what maximizes engagement. Over time, this can create feedback loops where increasingly extreme content rises to the top. No malicious AI master plan required. Just algorithms relentlessly optimizing for clicks, attention, and screen time, while the social side effects pile up in the background. Story 9. That the actual universe might be smaller than the observable universe, and the distant galaxies we are seeing are just our own local galactic supercluster. When it was much younger, the light emitted by those early stars back then took 13 billion years to reach us now. We won't be able to confidently for at least 1 billion years, and we won't be able to completely rule it out for another 13 billion. Though you could still find out within your lifetime by getting in a ship and constantly accelerating towards them, watching them the whole time, you'd eventually either see the Milky Way forming and see the solar system forming, and life on Earth quickly evolving, all of human history, and your own ship being launched. Everything after you left would be a blur, unless you turned around and started slowing down. Billions of years would be a blur, but you could still see it all. But by the time you got back to Earth, you'd be arriving at least 13 billion years after you left. Story 10. If the world were ending, most people wouldn't panic or fight back. They would just sit around and watch it happen. Humans like to imagine dramatic end-of-the-world scenarios where people suddenly become hyper-aware and start making heroic last stands or desperate attempts to fix everything. But a lot of real historical disasters suggest something different. When catastrophic events begin, people often respond with normalcy bias. That's the psychological tendency to assume things will continue the way they always have, even when there's clear evidence that something is very wrong. Instead of reacting immediately, many people hesitate, downplay the danger, or keep going about their routine. You see it during evacuations, financial collapses, and even natural disasters. Warnings are ignored. People wait too long to leave, and many continue doing ordinary things while the situation gets worse. Part of the reason is that huge threats are difficult for the human brain to process. When the scale of the problem is overwhelming, something like global collapse or extinction, it doesn't feel actionable. People often default to familiar behavior because it's psychologically easier than confronting something that feels impossible to stop. So the unsettling version of the theory is that the end of the world wouldn't necessarily look like chaos or cinematic panic. It might look like people scrolling their phones, watching the news, arguing online, going to work, and telling themselves that things will probably sort themselves out, right up until they don't. Story 11. You could cross the entire galaxy within a human lifetime if you kept accelerating at 1G the whole way. The key is something called relativistic time dilation. According to Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, time doesn't pass at the same rate for everyone. The faster you move relative to something else, the slower time passes for you compared to observers who aren't moving that fast. Now imagine a spaceship that can accelerate continuously at 1g, which is the same acceleration you feel from Earth's gravity. That means the people inside the ship would feel normal gravity the entire time, like standing on Earth, but they would keep getting faster and faster. As the ship approaches the speed of light, relativity kicks in hard. From the perspective of people back on Earth, the trip across the Milky Way, which is about 100,000 light-years across, would still take tens of thousands of years. But for the travelers on the ship, time would slow down dramatically. Because of that time dilation, the passengers might only experience a couple of decades passing during the journey. In theory, you could accelerate for about half the trip, flip the ship around, and decelerate for the second half, arriving on the other side of the galaxy having aged maybe 20 to 30 years. Of course, there's a huge catch. We currently have no technology capable of sustaining that kind of acceleration for decades, and the energy requirements would be enormous. But the physics itself is solid. Relativity says the galaxy is far bigger in time than it is in experienced travel time. Story 12. One theory about extraterrestrial life that sounds like something straight out of science fiction, but is actually taken seriously by some scientists, is the zoo hypothesis. It tries to explain the famous question known as the Fermi paradox. If intelligent life is likely to arise in the universe, and the galaxy is billions of years old, then why don't we see any clear signs of alien civilizations? Physicist Enrico Fermi famously summed it up with a simple question: where is everybody? The zoo hypothesis proposes a strange but possible answer. Instead of the universe being empty, advanced civilizations might already know we're here but deliberately avoid interacting with us. In this scenario, Earth is basically being treated like a protected wildlife preserve or a nature documentary set. The idea is that more technologically advanced species could have rules or cultural norms about not interfering with developing civilizations, similar to the way humans sometimes try to observe animals in the wild without disturbing them. Interference could change the natural development of a species or its culture. So instead of announcing themselves, they simply watch from a distance. In this view, aliens might already have the ability to detect Earth's radio signals, observe our technology, or monitor our planet with instruments far beyond anything we currently have. But they stay quiet on purpose. The theory sounds wild, but it's considered plausible enough that it occasionally shows up in serious discussions about the Fermi paradox. If it were true, it would mean humanity isn't alone in the universe. We're just not being allowed to join the conversation yet. Story 13. One theory that sounds like the plot of a sci-fi movie, but is actually discussed in scientific papers, is the Silurian hypothesis. The basic question is surprisingly simple. If an advanced industrial civilization existed on Earth millions of years ago, would we actually be able to detect it today? The idea was explored seriously by scientists like Gavin A. Schmidt, and the name itself is a playful reference to the intelligent reptile species from Doctor Who. But the concept behind it is a legitimate scientific thought experiment. Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, but our industrial civilization has only existed for a few hundred years. The fossil record is already incomplete, and geological processes constantly reshape the planet. Plate tectonics recycles crust, erosion wipes away structures, and organic materials decay surprisingly fast on geological timescales. Most cities would disappear completely after a few 100,000 years. Even steel, plastic, and concrete eventually break down or get buried under sediment. So the real question becomes, what would actually remain millions of years later. Scientists think the evidence wouldn't be things like buildings or machines. Instead, the clues would likely show up in chemical signatures in the rock record. For example, an industrial civilization might leave unusual spikes in carbon isotopes from fossil fuel burning, synthetic materials that don't occur naturally, or traces of plastics and industrial chemicals preserved in sediments. The Silurian hypothesis doesn't claim such a civilization existed. It's more about exploring how detectable industrial activity really is over deep time. And it leads to a weird realization. If something like us existed tens of millions of years ago, the evidence might be much harder to find than we assume. Story 14. The RMS Titanic sinking was actually part of an insurance fraud involving its sister ship, the RMS Olympic. The story goes like this. The Titanic and the Olympic were nearly identical ships built by the same company, the White Star Line. The Olympic launched first in 1911 and quickly ran into trouble. It collided with a British warship, the HMS Hawk, which caused serious structural damage and expensive repairs. The insurance situation around the accident reportedly left the company with major financial losses. According to the theory, the company secretly swapped the damaged Olympic with the nearly completed Titanic. The idea is that they renamed the Olympic as the Titanic and planned to deliberately sink it in order to collect a large insurance payout on the Titanic. On the surface, it sounds dramatic and fits the kind of conspiracy story people love. But when historians and ship experts look at the evidence, the theory falls apart pretty quickly. The two ships had hundreds of small design differences that are documented in shipyard records and photographs. The wreck of the Titanic on the ocean floor also clearly shows the ship's construction number, 401, which matches Titanic's build number at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Olympic's number was 400. Thousands of workers, engineers, and crew members were also involved in building and operating the ships. Pulling off a massive secret swap without anyone leaking proof would have been extremely unlikely. So while the idea of an insurance fraud makes for an intriguing conspiracy story, the physical evidence from the wreck and the historical records overwhelmingly show that the ship that sank in 1912 really was the Titanic. Story 15. One idea that sounds completely backwards but has actually been studied seriously in biology is that small doses of radiation might sometimes have beneficial effects on the body. Most people think of radiation as purely harmful, and at high doses, that's absolutely true. Large amounts of ionizing radiation damage DNA, increase cancer risk, and can cause radiation sickness. That's why radiation exposure is tightly regulated in medicine, industry, and nuclear environments. But there's a concept called radiation hormesis that suggests something interesting. Hormesis is a general biological idea where small doses of a harmful stressor can trigger protective responses in the body. Exercise is a classic example. Stressing muscles slightly causes them to repair and become stronger. Some researchers think low levels of radiation might trigger a similar response. Small exposures can activate DNA repair mechanisms, antioxidant production, and other cellular defense systems. In theory, that mild stress could make cells better at repairing damage overall. A few studies have even suggested that populations living in areas with slightly higher natural background radiation sometimes show similar or even slightly lower cancer rates than expected. However, this idea is still debated. Most regulatory agencies follow what's called the linear no-threshold model, which assumes that any radiation exposure carries at least some risk, even if the risk is extremely small. Because radiation damage can accumulate, public health guidelines are designed to minimize exposure whenever possible. So, while the possibility of beneficial effects at very low doses is an active area of research, it hasn't replaced the mainstream view that limiting radiation exposure is still the safest policy. Still, the idea that something as dangerous as radiation might sometimes trigger helpful biological responses is pretty counterintuitive. Story 16. Small habits compound theory. The basic idea is that tiny daily choices, things so small they barely feel important in the moment, can quietly shape the direction of your entire life over time. Most people tend to think big life changes come from big decisions. Choosing a career, moving cities, starting a business, things like that. But the theory suggests the real drivers of long-term outcomes are often the small behaviors repeated every day. The reason comes down to compounding. If you improve something by just 1% each day, the change is almost invisible at first. Skipping one workout doesn't ruin your health. Reading 10 pages instead of watching TV doesn't suddenly make you a genius. Eating one slightly healthier meal doesn't transform your body. Each individual action seems too small to matter, but repetition changes everything. Those tiny improvements stack on top of each other over weeks, months, and years. The same is true in the opposite direction. Small negative habits, slightly less sleep, slightly worse diet, slightly more procrastination, also compound over time. At first, nothing seems different. Then years later, the gap becomes huge. One person who reads a few pages every day might have read hundreds of books. Someone who invested small amounts regularly might end up with substantial savings. Someone who exercised consistently might have dramatically better health. So the theory isn't that single choices determine your future. It's that the quiet accumulation of small daily habits slowly builds the trajectory of your life. Story 17. The idea that everything eventually passes. At any given moment, whatever crisis or hardship people are living through can feel permanent. Wars, economic crashes, personal losses, political turmoil, pandemics. When you're inside the event itself, it often feels like the world has permanently changed for the worse. But if you zoom out across decades or centuries, something strange appears. Human societies keep going. Entire generations live through events that seem like they should break civilization completely. The Black Death wiped out huge portions of Europe's population. World wars destroyed cities and killed tens of millions of people. Economic depressions collapsed entire financial systems, yet somehow societies reorganize, rebuild, and move forward. Even on a personal level, the pattern shows up. Moments that once felt unbearable, grief, failure, embarrassment, uncertainty, slowly fade as time moves forward. People adapt in ways they often don't expect when they're in the middle of the situation. This isn't really a scientific theory so much as a pattern that appears again and again in history and psychology. Human beings are incredibly good at adjusting to new realities. What once seemed catastrophic gradually becomes part of the past, replaced by new routines and new problems. It doesn't mean suffering isn't real or serious, but over and over again, time moves forward, circumstances change, and life continues in ways people couldn't imagine during the worst moments. So the oddly comforting observation is that even the most overwhelming situations eventually become something that people survive and move beyond. Story 18. The possibility that invasive species could be used as a form of biological sabotage between countries. Invasive species already cause enormous damage on their own. When a non-native organism enters a new ecosystem with no natural predators, it can spread rapidly and disrupt agriculture, wildlife, and even public health. Things like invasive insects destroying forests, foreign plant diseases wiping out crops, or mosquito-borne illnesses spreading in new regions can cost countries billions of dollars and years of recovery. Because of that, some people speculate that a hostile country could deliberately introduce certain species into another country's environment. In theory, it could weaken agriculture, damage ecosystems, and create expensive long-term problems without looking like a direct attack. If a strange beetle shows up in a forest or a new fish species appears in a river, it's easy to assume it arrived accidentally through trade or travel. The concept is sometimes discussed under the broader idea of biological or ecological warfare. However, there's very little evidence that modern invasive species problems are the result of deliberate foreign sabotage. Most of them can be traced back to much more ordinary causes like global shipping, cargo transport, tourism, ballast water from ships, or animals and plants accidentally hitchhiking across borders. Still, the idea sticks around because invasive species can cause such massive damage while appearing almost random. So, while there's no solid proof that countries are secretly releasing fish, insects, or diseases to harm rivals, the fact that ecosystems can be disrupted so easily makes the concept feel just plausible enough to capture people's imagination. Story 19, The Theory of Evolution by Natural Selection. Before the 1800s, most people believed species were fixed and unchanging. The idea that animals and plants could slowly transform into entirely different species over time seemed absurd. The natural world was usually thought of as static, with every creature created exactly as it appeared. Then Charles Darwin proposed something radically different. Darwin suggested that species change gradually over generations through a process called natural selection. Individuals within a species have small variations, and some of those variations make survival or reproduction slightly easier in a particular environment. Those traits get passed on more often, and over long periods of time, the population slowly changes. Given enough time, those changes can become so large that entirely new species emerge. At first, this idea seemed unbelievable. The thought that humans and other animals share common ancestors felt almost insulting to many people in the 19th century. But over time, evidence started piling up from multiple directions. The fossil record shows transitional species appearing over millions of years. Genetics reveals that all living things share the same basic DNA language, and the similarities between species map out a clear family tree. Scientists can even watch evolution happening today in rapidly reproducing organisms like bacteria and viruses. What once sounded like a wild theory, that all life on Earth is connected through common ancestry, has become the foundation of modern biology. The strange part is that the more evidence we discover, the clearer it becomes that every living organism on Earth is part of the same enormous evolutionary story. Story 20. One theory that sounds like pure celebrity conspiracy talk, but isn't completely impossible in principle, is the idea that some famous people who supposedly died may have secretly faked their deaths to escape public life and live normally again. The logic behind it is pretty simple. Extreme fame can be incredibly restrictive. Global celebrities often can't go anywhere without security, paparazzi, and constant attention. Every relationship, mistake, or private moment becomes public. Some people argue that if someone truly wanted to disappear and had enough money and connections, faking a death might be the only way to permanently step out of the spotlight. There are also historical cases of people successfully disappearing or assuming new identities, especially before modern digital tracking and biometric systems existed. Wealthy individuals could theoretically arrange legal help, false documentation, and relocation somewhere quiet. That's why this idea often shows up around certain famous deaths. Fans sometimes point to strange details in reports, unusual timing, or claims that the person was unhappy with fame and wanted to escape it. However, in reality, successfully pulling something like that off would be incredibly difficult. Major celebrity deaths usually involve hospitals, families, law enforcement, autopsies, and large numbers of witnesses. Keeping all of those people silent indefinitely would require a massive coordinated effort with almost no leaks, which is extremely unlikely. So while the theory isn't literally impossible on a technical level, there's no solid evidence that famous figures actually faked their deaths to disappear. Still, the idea sticks around because it taps into something people understand. Sometimes the only true escape from overwhelming fame would be becoming someone else entirely. Story 21. One philosophical idea that sounds almost too simple to be meaningful, but becomes surprisingly convincing when you follow the reasoning, is René Descartes' famous argument, "I think, therefore I am." In the 1600s, René Descartes set out to answer a strange question. What is something we can know with absolute certainty? To figure that out, he tried something radical. He decided to doubt everything. He imagined that maybe the senses can't be trusted. After all, our eyes and ears can be fooled by illusions. Maybe the world around us isn't real. Maybe we're dreaming. Maybe some powerful being is even manipulating everything we experience. If all those possibilities exist, Descartes argued, then almost everything we normally believe about reality could theoretically be wrong. But during this process of extreme doubt, he realized something important. Even if everything else were fake, the world, other people, even his own body, the very act of doubting still required a mind that was doing the doubting. If you're questioning whether anything is real, something must exist that is doing the questioning. That's where the famous conclusion comes from. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The idea is that while you might be able to doubt the existence of the outside world, you cannot logically doubt that your own consciousness exists, because the act of thinking itself proves that something is there doing the thinking. It's one of the simplest arguments in philosophy, but it's also one of the hardest to escape. Story 22. It's more a theory I came up with, but it's the balance theory. Because when you observe the universe, you notice everything is perfectly balanced. The second there is destabilization. The universe will try to make everything balance again. For example, climate change. We are warming up the planet, but the planet is supposed to be in a sweet zone of heat and cold. Also, if there's an imbalance in the food chain, the entire food chain gets messed with more of a certain animal, the less there will be of another. Also, in life, we are supposed to die, and it's to keep the population low. So if a kid has cancer, it is super sad, but it's life trying to balance overpopulation. Story 23. One idea that once sounded completely absurd but turned out to be one of the fundamental truths of the universe is gravity itself. At first glance, gravity seems obvious. Things fall down, planets orbit the sun, the moon circles Earth. But the idea that the same invisible force responsible for an apple falling from a tree is also controlling the motion of planets and stars was once a shocking concept. Before the 1600s, people believed the heavens followed different rules than the Earth. The sky was thought to operate under its own special laws, separate from the physics of everyday objects. The motion of planets was often explained through complex systems of perfect spheres and divine order. Then Isaac Newton proposed something radical. He suggested that every object in the universe pulls on every other object with a force proportional to their mass and the distance between them. In other words, the same force pulling an apple toward the ground is also pulling the moon toward Earth and the planets toward the sun. That idea unified the physics of Earth and space for the first time. Centuries later, scientists discovered something even stranger. Gravity isn't actually a force in the traditional sense at all. According to Albert Einstein, massive objects warp the fabric of space and time itself, and other objects simply move along those curves. So what feels like a force pulling you downward is actually the geometry of space-time guiding your motion. The universe doesn't pull things together. It bends reality, and everything follows the curve. Story 24, the simulation hypothesis. The basic idea is that reality might not be the base level of existence. Instead, the universe could be a kind of simulation running on some vastly more advanced system. Everything we experience, space, time, matter, consciousness, would just be the internal behavior of that system. The modern version of this argument was popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom. His reasoning wasn't that we definitely live in a simulation, but that if civilizations eventually develop enormous computing power, they might run huge numbers of simulated worlds to study history, test physics, or explore possibilities. If that happens often enough, statistically there could be far more simulated realities than real ones. And if that's the case, it raises a strange probability question. It might be more likely that we're inside one of those simulations than in the original base universe. What makes the idea interesting is that it doesn't require some dramatic sci-fi scenario where higher beings are watching us like a TV show. In fact, a much more mundane version is possible. The universe could simply be a side effect of some large computational process, something completely boring and unimportant from the outside. No one is studying us, no one cares what humans are doing, and our entire cosmos might just be the internal behavior of a system running for some unrelated purpose. In that scenario, we wouldn't be the focus of the simulation at all. We'd just be a tiny pattern that emerged inside it. Story 25. Not sure it qualifies as a theory, but one of my favorite postulates is that every system is perfectly designed to produce the results you get. I use this a lot as a chief people officer, and I'm at odds with production/manufacturing when they are perplexed at securing undesirable results from one of their brilliant ideas, and it's usually one that disregards humanism and sees workers as machines. Perhaps what will drive this home is Wells Fargo. When they incentivized opening new accounts, they got new accounts, albeit fictitious dummy accounts. So the system was designed to produce exactly what they got. Story 26. Some companies intentionally design products to be harder to repair so people replace them sooner. The concept is often called planned obsolescence. Instead of making products that last as long as technically possible, companies sometimes design them in ways that shorten their useful life or make repairs difficult. That can mean using glued components instead of screws, sealing batteries inside devices, requiring proprietary tools, or restricting replacement parts so only the manufacturer can perform repairs. From a business perspective, the incentive is pretty straightforward. If a phone, laptop, or appliance lasts 20 years and is easy to repair, the company sells far fewer replacements. But if repairs are difficult, expensive, or impossible, customers are more likely to simply buy a new product. There are also documented examples that make the idea feel less like speculation. Some printers stop working after reaching a certain internal counter. Certain smartphones have batteries that are difficult to replace. Some tractors and electronics require manufacturer software just to perform basic repairs. Because of this, the issue has become a major policy debate in recent years. The right to repair movement argues that consumers and independent repair shops should have access to parts, manuals, and tools so products can be fixed instead of thrown away. Supporters say it would reduce waste and give consumers more control over devices they own. So while not every product is deliberately designed to fail, the idea that companies sometimes make devices harder to repair in order to drive future sales is now widely acknowledged as a real business strategy. Story 27. One idea that sounds cynical at first, but becomes strangely relatable. The more you look at history, is the feeling that almost every wild theory about the world feels plausible, except the one where some outside force shows up to save us. People have always hoped that when things get bad enough, something or someone will step in and fix it. In science fiction, that role often gets filled by advanced aliens who arrive just in time to stop humanity from destroying itself. It's a comforting idea that somewhere out there is a wiser civilization willing to intervene before things go too far. But when you look at how reality tends to work, that scenario starts to feel like the least likely one. History shows that major crises, wars, pandemics, economic collapses, political upheaval, usually don't get solved by sudden outside rescue. They're messy, complicated problems that societies struggle through slowly, often making mistakes along the way. Progress tends to come from gradual adaptation rather than dramatic last-minute salvation. There's also something very human about the expectation of rescue. It reflects a desire for some higher authority, whether that's aliens, advanced technology, or some hidden force, to step in and impose order when things feel chaotic. But the pattern we actually see is different. Human civilization keeps stumbling forward mostly through trial, error, conflict, and adjustment, with no external reset button. Problems get worse, then people slowly reorganize and find ways to live with new realities. So, the uncomfortable conclusion some people come to is that if humanity ever gets into serious trouble, there probably isn't a cosmic safety net waiting in the wings. The only ones around to fix things are us. Story 28. Soviet intelligence played a very long strategic game aimed at influencing Western institutions over decades. During the Cold War, the Soviet intelligence agency, known as the KGB, spent enormous resources on what they called active measures. These weren't traditional spy operations focused only on stealing secrets. Instead, they included propaganda, disinformation campaigns, political influence operations, and attempts to exploit divisions inside rival countries. The goal wasn't necessarily to defeat the United States militarily, but to weaken it internally by encouraging distrust, polarization, and corruption within democratic institutions. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the intelligence networks and strategies developed during that period didn't simply disappear. Some analysts argue that influence operations evolved instead of ending, using different methods such as financial relationships, media manipulation, and information warfare. Part of the concern people raise in this theory is that powerful individuals, business leaders, politicians, or media figures could potentially become vulnerable to influence through financial incentives, political pressure, or compromising information. In that scenario, foreign governments wouldn't need direct control over a country's institutions. They would only need to nudge key actors in ways that slowly shape decisions over time. There's documented evidence that foreign intelligence services attempt influence operations in many countries, including the United States. However, claims about large-scale coordinated control of political or economic elites remain heavily debated and often lack clear proof. Still, the idea resonates with people because it reflects a real strategy used in international politics, Sometimes the most effective way to weaken a rival isn't direct confrontation, but slowly influencing the systems that hold it together. Story 29. That cell phones function as incredibly effective tracking devices. The theory usually goes something like this. Modern smartphones constantly communicate with nearby cell towers, satellites, Wi-Fi networks, and apps, which means they are always broadcasting information about where they are. From that perspective, carrying a phone around essentially creates a detailed record of a person's movements. And in a purely technical sense, that part is true. Every time a phone connects to a cellular network, it identifies itself to the nearest tower, so the network knows where to route calls or data. By measuring signals between multiple towers, the network can estimate the phone's location. GPS makes that even more precise. Smartphones also contain sensors and apps that can collect location data for navigation, ride services, weather apps, and many other features. Because of that, phones can generate extremely accurate location histories. However, the idea that cell phones were originally invented as government tracking devices doesn't match the historical record. Cellular technology was developed primarily by telecommunications companies as a way to create portable phone networks. The location capability was a side effect of how mobile communication systems work. Phones need to tell the network where they are, so calls can reach them. That said, governments and law enforcement agencies have learned to use the data generated by these systems in investigations, sometimes with warrants and sometimes in controversial ways. So while phones weren't created as tracking devices, the infrastructure that makes them work does mean that carrying one effectively places you inside a global positioning and communication network almost all the time. Story 30. One theory that keeps resurfacing around the assassination of John F. Kennedy is the idea that the official explanation that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone with a rifle seems too simple for such a massive historical event. The official investigation, conducted by the Warren Commission, concluded in 1964 that Oswald fired the shots from the Texas School Book Depository using a bolt-action rifle and that he acted alone. Later reviews by government agencies largely upheld that conclusion, although some acknowledged unanswered questions. The reason alternative theories keep appearing is that the assassination involved many confusing details. The chaotic scene in Dealey Plaza, conflicting eyewitness accounts, and the fact that Oswald himself was killed just 2 days later before a full trial could take place. Those gaps created space for speculation. Over the decades, people have proposed many possible groups that might have had motives: organized crime figures, angry over crackdowns, anti-Castro or pro-Castro groups connected to Cuba, elements of intelligence agencies, or foreign governments during the tense Cold War period. However, despite decades of investigations, released documents, and historical research, no conclusive evidence has proven that any larger conspiracy actually carried out the assassination. Most historians and official inquiries still conclude that Oswald was responsible for the shooting. What makes the story persist is the psychological side of history. When a world-changing event happens, especially something as shocking as the assassination of a president, people often struggle to accept that it could come from a single individual rather than a complex, hidden plot. Sometimes the simplest explanation still feels the hardest to believe. Story 31. A cynical conspiracy, but is now widely discussed in economics and public policy, is the belief that large pharmaceutical companies sometimes keep drug prices extremely high because the system allows it. Developing a new medication is incredibly expensive and risky. Companies often spend billions of dollars and many years researching, testing, and running clinical trials before a drug is approved. Because of that, pharmaceutical companies are granted patents, which give them exclusive rights to sell the drug for a period of time. During that window, they can set the price without direct competition. In theory, those profits help recover research costs and fund future drug development, but critics argue that the system can also be exploited. Companies sometimes extend patent protection through small changes to existing drugs, a strategy often called evergreening. Others acquire older medications that were once inexpensive and dramatically raise the price because there are few or no competitors producing them. In some cases, drugs that cost only a few dollars to manufacture are sold for hundreds or even thousands. Because healthcare is often a necessity rather than a choice, patients may have little ability to refuse the price. This has turned drug pricing into a major political issue, especially in countries like the United States, where the government historically had limited ability to negotiate prices directly with pharmaceutical companies. Supporters of the industry argue that strong profits are necessary to maintain innovation and fund life-saving treatments. Critics argue the current system sometimes prioritizes shareholder returns over affordability. So while it's not a secret conspiracy, the concern that pharmaceutical pricing structures can lead to extremely high costs is a real debate involving economics, healthcare policy, and the balance between innovation and access to medicine. Story 32. The idea that religion was created mainly as a system to control behavior and collect resources like taxes or tribute. The argument comes from looking at how organized religions historically became intertwined with political power. In many ancient civilizations, religious institutions were closely connected to the state. Priests often worked alongside rulers. Temples collected offerings, and religious rules sometimes reinforced social hierarchies or laws. In places like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and parts of medieval Europe, religious authorities and governments often supported each other. Because of that overlap, some historians and sociologists argue that religion can function as a social organizing system. Shared beliefs can encourage cooperation, establish moral norms, and legitimize authority structures. In that sense, religion sometimes helps societies maintain order and coordinate large populations. However, the idea that religion was created exclusively for control or taxation isn't supported by most historical research. Archaeological evidence shows that religious practices existed long before complex states or tax systems appeared. Early human societies performed rituals, burial ceremonies, and spiritual practices tens of thousands of years ago, when there were no large governments collecting taxes. Anthropologists generally believe religion developed gradually from human attempts to explain natural phenomena, cope with death, create community identity, and pass down moral traditions. Over time, as civilizations became larger and more organized, political leaders and institutions sometimes incorporated religion into governance. So religion has often been used by power structures, but most scholars think it wasn't originally invented solely for that purpose. It likely emerged from a mixture of cultural, psychological, and social factors that evolved alongside human societies. Story 33. There is an alien presence, but it's not as exciting as people think. There are no little green men, but there is an autonomous network of non-man-made machines that have been monitoring Earth since long before humans evolved to this point. This doesn't make Earth special. All life-supporting planets are cataloged and monitored by this advanced civilization, or group of civilizations, that have had billions more years of time to evolve than us. Of course, they would be at least mildly curious about other life-supporting planets, whether for scientific, sociological, or other reasons. Having a program that sends drones to catalog and observe these planets is probably a very small ask for a civilization exponentially more advanced than us. These machines are elusive and standoffish because these civilizations don't want to mess with our development, and openly interacting with us would immediately poison that development. Story 34. Planned or programmed obsolescence. The basic suspicion people have is simple. Products often seem to fail right after the warranty expires. Phones slow down after a few years, appliances suddenly break, batteries stop holding a charge, and replacing parts is often harder than buying a new device. It makes people wonder if companies intentionally design products to wear out faster. In some cases, that suspicion isn't completely unfounded. One of the most famous historical examples is the Phoebus cartel in the 1920s. Major light bulb manufacturers agreed to limit the lifespan of bulbs to around 1,000 hours, even though longer-lasting designs already existed. The goal was simple. If bulbs lasted longer, companies would sell fewer replacements. The idea has also appeared in modern technology. Some products are built with sealed components, glued parts, or proprietary screws that make repairs difficult. Batteries are sometimes integrated in ways that make them expensive or impractical to replace. Software updates can also affect performance on older devices, which sometimes pushes users toward upgrading. However, not every product failure is intentional. Modern electronics are extremely complex, and companies also face pressure to reduce manufacturing costs, keep devices thin and lightweight, and release new models frequently. Those factors can lead to shorter lifespans even without a deliberate plan to make things fail. So the reality is somewhere in the middle. There have been documented cases where companies intentionally shortened product lifespans, but many failures also come from design trade-offs, cost pressures, and the rapid pace of technological change. Still, the reason the idea resonates with people is that when things break suspiciously close to the warranty date, it's hard not to wonder. Story 35. One idea that sounds pretty cynical but is actually grounded in some real historical tactics is the claim that companies or industries sometimes try to manipulate public protest movements or the perception of them to discredit criticism. The logic behind the theory is simple. If an industry is facing legitimate criticism, the most effective way to neutralize that criticism isn't always to argue against it directly. Instead, it can be more effective to make the critics look unreasonable, disruptive, or extreme so the public stops taking them seriously. There's a long history of something called astroturfing. That's when organizations secretly fund or organize groups that appear to be grassroots movements. These groups can promote a message that benefits the industry while pretending to be independent citizens or activists. In some cases, companies have also hired public relations firms to influence public debate, amplify certain voices, or shape how protests are portrayed in the media. The tobacco industry, for example, funded organizations and messaging campaigns designed to create doubt about the health risks of smoking and to push back against anti-smoking movements. There have also been documented cases of infiltration or monitoring of activist groups by corporations or governments, often to gather information or influence strategy. That said, the idea that protesters are commonly paid to behave badly on purpose in order to sabotage their own cause is much harder to prove and doesn't have clear evidence as a widespread tactic. Most protests are organized by people who genuinely support the issue they're demonstrating about. Still, the broader idea that powerful organizations sometimes try to shape public opinion by influencing how criticism appears to the public is something that has definitely happened in various forms throughout history. Story 36. The mattress firm conspiracy. The basic idea is that the stores are actually fronts for money laundering because there are so many of them, often very close to each other, and they always look empty. People point to examples where a single street might have multiple mattress stores within a few blocks. Since mattresses aren't something most people buy frequently, maybe once every 8 to 10 years, It seems strange that so many dedicated stores could stay in business selling such an occasional purchase. Add the fact that when you walk past one, there are rarely customers inside, and it starts to feel suspicious. But when analysts looked into it, the explanation turned out to be a lot less dramatic. Mattress stores actually operate on very high profit margins. A mattress that costs a few $100s to manufacture can sell for several thousand. Because people buy them so infrequently, stores don't need a constant stream of customers to stay profitable. Selling just a handful each day can cover the rent and operating costs. There's also a business reason for why they cluster together. Over the years, Mattress Firm grew by acquiring many smaller mattress chains. After those acquisitions, the company sometimes ended up with multiple locations that had originally been competing brands, but they were now all owned by the same parent company. So the strange situation where several mattress stores appear on the same street is often just the result of retail consolidation and high-margin products, not secret criminal activity. Still, the image of dozens of empty mattress stores sitting side by side was weird enough that the conspiracy theory basically became an internet meme. Story 37. The claim that companies sometimes try to shape public opposition in ways that make it look unreasonable or extreme. The logic behind the theory is strategic. If an industry is facing criticism, like oil companies dealing with environmental concerns, one way to weaken that criticism isn't necessarily to argue against it directly. Instead, the goal could be to make the movement opposing them look disruptive, irrational, or out of touch with everyday people. There is a real concept related to this called astroturfing. That's when corporations or political groups secretly fund organizations that appear to be grassroots movements. These groups can promote messages that benefit the sponsor while pretending to represent ordinary citizens. There are also documented cases of companies using public relations firms to influence public opinion about controversial industries. For example, fossil fuel companies have historically funded campaigns designed to question climate science, shift blame to consumer behavior, or delay regulation. However, the specific claim that oil companies regularly fund protest groups to behave badly on purpose, like blocking roads or damaging art to make environmental activism look ridiculous, doesn't currently have strong evidence behind it. Most environmental protest groups are genuinely organized by activists who believe strongly in their cause, even if their tactics are controversial or unpopular. Still, the broader idea that powerful industries try to shape the narrative around criticism, influence public perception, and protect their reputation through strategic communication campaigns is well documented. The differences between influencing public opinion and secretly controlling the opposition itself, which would be a much harder thing to prove. Story 38. The Boltzmann brain hypothesis. The idea comes from work by the 19th century physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who studied entropy and the statistical behavior of the universe. In very simplified terms, Boltzmann showed that, given enough time, random fluctuations in matter and energy can occasionally produce highly ordered structures, even in an otherwise chaotic system. Now imagine applying that idea to the entire universe. If the universe lasts for an extremely long time, trillions upon trillions of years, random fluctuations could theoretically assemble something incredibly complex purely by chance. In principle, that could include something as complicated as a self-aware brain, complete with temporary memories and perceptions. This hypothetical object is what physicists call a Boltzmann brain. The strange implication is that if the universe is infinite or lasts long enough, random fluctuations might create isolated conscious brains far more often than they create entire orderly universes like the one we observe. That leads to a disturbing philosophical question. Statistically speaking, it might actually be more likely for a single consciousness to randomly appear with false memories of a past than for an entire coherent universe to exist around it. Physicists bring this up not because they think it's literally happening, but because any cosmological theory that predicts lots of Boltzmann brains is considered a problem. Still, the idea that a thinking mind could theoretically appear out of random cosmic noise is one of the strangest consequences of modern physics. Story 39, The Dark Forest Hypothesis. It's an attempt to explain the Fermi paradox, the puzzle of why, in a universe with billions of galaxies and potentially habitable planets, we still haven't clearly detected alien civilizations. The dark forest idea imagines the universe like a dark forest, where every civilization is a hunter moving silently through the trees. The reasoning goes like this. If intelligent civilizations exist, they have no reliable way to know whether another civilization is friendly or hostile. And if a hostile civilization discovers you first and is technologically superior, it could wipe you out before you even realize the threat exists. Because of that risk, the safest strategy for survival might be to stay completely silent. Any civilization that broadcasts its location loudly could be taking a huge gamble. From that perspective, the reason we don't hear signals from advanced civilizations might not be because they don't exist, but because everyone is deliberately hiding. The theory suggests that advanced societies may avoid sending detectable signals, avoid large visible megastructures, and avoid announcing their presence to the cosmos. It sounds paranoid, but the logic is based on game theory. If the cost of being discovered by a hostile civilization is extinction, staying quiet could be the rational strategy. So, the unsettling possibility is that the universe might actually be full of intelligent life, and everyone is just lying low and hoping nobody notices them. Story 40, The False Vacuum Hypothesis. The idea comes from quantum field theory, which suggests that the vacuum of space, the empty background of the universe, might not actually be in its most stable state. Instead, the universe could be sitting in something called a false vacuum, which is like a temporary plateau of stability rather than the absolute lowest energy state possible. Think of it like a ball sitting in a shallow dip on a hill rather than at the bottom of the valley. It looks stable, but if something nudges it enough, it could roll down to a lower energy state. If that happened to the universe, the transition wouldn't be gradual. According to the theory, a bubble of true vacuum could suddenly form somewhere in space and start expanding outward at nearly the speed of light. Inside that bubble, the fundamental laws of physics might be different. Constants could change, particles might behave differently, and the chemistry that allows atoms, stars, and life to exist might no longer work. Anything the bubble touches would instantly be replaced by this new version of physics. The strange part is that if such a transition ever began, we would never see it coming. Because the bubble expands at light speed, the moment you detect it is the moment it reaches you. Physicists don't think this is likely to happen anytime soon, but the math allows the possibility. So, one unsettling implication of modern physics is that the entire universe might only be temporarily stable, and if it ever changes, it would happen without warning.